Hello, everyone. Welcome to Meet a Poet. My name is Sophia Hall, and I'm today's moderator for the Meet a Poet series. I'm a poet myself from Washington, D.C., where I served as the Youth Poet Laureate in 2023. And I'm also currently a student at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I study English and creative writing. I'm delighted to introduce today's poet for our Meet a Poet program, Rita Feinstein. Rita is the author of the young adult novel and verse Meet Me in the Fourth Dimension and two poetry collections from Brain Mill Press. Her stories and poems have appeared in Salamander Magazine, Beloit Poetry Journal, and Willow Springs, among other publications, and have been nominated for Best of the Net and Best New Poets. She lives also in Washington, D.C. with her husband, who is a lawyer, and her dog, who, alas, is not. Thank you, Rita, for joining us today. I'm really excited to hear your poems aloud. Just so you guys know, after the reading, we're going to have a brief Q&A session. So as you're listening, feel free to put questions in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to Rita. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm very excited to be here and very excited to be in conversation with you. So I'm going to start with a poem called When I Came Back Later, the Book Was Gone. And the readings that I'm going to do are going to move from the more realistic and grounded into the more fantastical. But this one here I chose as the entry point because it's a little bit of a personal origin story, but it also introduces the themes of magical thinking that are present throughout a lot of the pieces I'm going to read. When I came back later, the book was gone. It belonged in a curiosity cabinet between a homunculus skull and a philosopher's stone, not on a bottom shelf of the school library. It was blue, untitled, and full of cryptozoological sketches of deep sea creatures. It was, I thought, the most important discovery I'd ever make, but I didn't know what to do with such power. I checked out The Unicorn and the Lake instead, the same book I checked out every week. The ending was the same each time, the unicorn retreating into the mountains and the animals forgetting their common language. Maybe I'd be a different person if I'd taken the blue book. Maybe I wouldn't have walked away from you. And then this next one I'm going to read, I also see as a little bit of a personal origin story. This one is a nod to Sylvia Plath, who was really hugely influential for me in my own writing journey. I discovered her when I was 17, and that hit me at the right time. And her work just deeply spoke to me. And I knew that I wanted to pursue poetry and do something similar. So this one is a little bit of an ode to her work. This is called That One Summer I Was Really Into Sylvia Plath. I wasted away to a sprig of rosemary. I grew as translucent as a nightgown. I saw my own worthlessness in everything. A receding tide line or hairline, a late train, an early frost. I broke every bone in the sky and then reconstructed its skull, the sun and moon its eyes, the earth its burning brain. I cut the kindling, I struck the match. My bangs were a fringe of pine needles and caught quickly. The fire fit like an off-the-rack wedding dress. My mouth was full of blackberries. It was more sweetness than I could bear. So these next two poems both incorporate tarot card imagery, which is something that I explore a lot in my work. That was something that was very important to me when I was a teenager and important to my family, and also just sort of got incorporated into my work and my point of view as a sort of symbolic language. So this one here is called The God of Your Own Thinness. You draw the tower, its crown shattered by barb-tailed lightning, its black windows weeping embers. Your goddess tarot deck is supposed to give you something to read besides nutrition facts, something to believe when you've been flickering in and out of faith in the God of your own thinness. But the tower's on fire and you're the one throwing the lightning. You've created a religion and you are your own human sacrifice. Everyone who sees you starts to pray. So this next one is another tarot card poem. This one I wrote in grad school when I was really starting to experiment with voice in ways that I hadn't done before. I don't know if this shows up, but this is all lowercase, which seems like a very small stylistic choice, but it was something that I had never done before. And I was figuring out when that feels like an interesting or appropriate stylistic choice to bring in. And here for this one, I felt like the voice of the speaker comes through as so small and so diminished that it felt like the right choice. So this one is significant to me as being a little bit of a stylistic and experimental milestone for me. 10 of Swords. It means things can't get any worse, so they might as well get better. But in the card, the sky is all black, except for a low pulsing dawn, like a yellow wound undressing. But it could be just another sunset, spilling more blood, burying more blades in my back. And why is their aim so good when I miss everything I swing for? Shh, sulking won't change anything. I promised myself I'd never feel sorry for myself again, but I feel like I failed you. You always tell me to change my mind, as if depression is a brown pear I don't have to eat. So I almost don't recognize you when you say, I hate to think of you there without me. And you take the sadness by the pommel, you take what's out of reach, you take the pain and you take it away, one sword at a time. And just for a little more imagistic context on that one, actually, in the Rider-Waite tarot deck, the 10 of Swords is depicted as a person who is lying face down in blood. It's very gory, and their back is pierced with 10 swords, and it's a very alarmingly violent image. And there's something so excessive about it that it almost seems absurd. And one interpretation of that card is that this is the dark night of the soul. This is really bad, but it can't possibly get worse. And so things are going to get better. And I was always interested in that card as sort of the culmination of tragedy with a little bit of hope on the horizon. Okay, so moving into a different set now. I'm really interested in exploring different tropes from mythology and fairy tale and folklore and fantasy and sci-fi in my work. And the next few I'm going to read are from an unpublished project I have, which is a chapbook of poems that all explore the Hades and Persephone myth. And I want to do a shout out to my grad school mentor, Jen Richter, who taught an amazing class called Myths, Mothers, and Monsters that was very formative to my work. And we read a lot of feminist retellings of traditional myths in that class. And that's what introduced me to the idea that a character like Persephone, who in Greek mythology is, sucked into the underworld against her will, the idea that that kind of character could have agency in a retelling and could make her own choices and could choose to go with Hades and become an empowered queen of the underworld. So I was really inspired to do my own Persephone retelling. And these few walk us through a little bit of the arc and the collection of Persephone's relationship to Hades, which in my iteration starts out a little rocky, but ultimately does become that very positive and very empowered relationship. So this first one here is called Persephone Waits for Spring. There isn't enough stale coffee to last the winter. Even when watered down so much, it tastes only like heat. She has to crawl onto the counter, faux granite marbled like fatty blood, to reach the coffee, a cheerless holiday blend. She shakes the last of the bag into her French press and waits for it to darken and fortify. Those first few sips are as promising as the sound of his feet on the stairs. Every day is the day he might say you can go home. But everything he says is a false spring, a peach blossom taking its first breath, then broken in a fist of snow. And this one is called The Queen. That autumn, all the ponderosa pines were monsoon slick and tingling. No fires to flee, no good reason to burrow beneath the earth, except my tall blonde Hades promising me the throne of the damned. Our house in the mouth of the woods was dirty white like an unearthed corpse. On our anniversary, he found a wire heart scabbed in rust and dragged it against the stump where I would see it. I'm the queen, I keened to myself as I chopped our last onion. At night, our sheets were brittle as pained ice. I didn't know how to touch him without opening the cracks between us. And there are some other plot things and relationship developments that happen in between, but I wanted to end this selection on a more positive note. So this one is the counterpoint poem to The Queen. So this one is called The King. Dawn sheaths the branches in red ice. Fog lifts from the frozen fields like a curse dispelled. I hear him arise and begin his descent. He pauses on the threshold, gazing at me tenderly. I only get up in the morning, he says, because I know you'll be waiting for me downstairs. So continuing with myth and folklore, but going into a different project, these next few I call the bride poems. So they're an arc of related prose poems. And these are part of my collection, Everything is Real, which is one of my collections from Brain Mill Press. And that collection, which I can speak more about later, examines the power dynamic in relationships, and particularly in these, pulling from different parts of myth, folklore, and fantasy, to look at the intersection between gender and power. So this first one is called The Fox Bride. Once upon a time, all women were foxes and all men were hunters. The older the fox, the longer she had evaded capture, the more tails she grew. Our nine-tailed heroine made running look easy. No man had touched her, and precious few had seen her. She'd forsworn sleep years ago. She missed the dreams, but mostly she missed the nightmares. She'd forgotten the terror that first spurred her to run. Now she couldn't stop if she wanted to. She was tired of running, and her beautiful tales were so heavy. She would have given them all for one night of torment. When she stepped into a bear trap, she thought she was finally dreaming. Once, she might have chewed her own foot off, but she preferred the trap's sharp bite. She wondered how bad the pain could get. She wondered if she could keep pace with it. Patiently, she waited as a bracelet of blood beads sprouted around her ankle. When the hunter entered the clearing, she welcomed him like her own demise. This one is called The Sphinx's Bride. Once upon a time, there was a girl who was good at riddles. She solved her way across the world until she came to the mountain pass and beheld the terrible Sphinx lording over his area of bones. His voice echoed like a fever dream, deafening, yet only in her head. If a girl is in love with her own mind, which one of them is crazy? The answer leapt into her mouth, but she bit it back, rolling it under her tongue like a morsel of raw lamb. Looking beyond his roost, she saw his fabled treasure, just a dead civilization, all its gods entombed in dust. She no longer wanted the reward, not that reward. She sandaled closer to the great beast, gasping as his wings enfolded her like grape leaves. His eyes were the clear green of olive oil, a softness you could dip bread in. Did he take pleasure in his kills, she wondered, or was he fettered to a curse? Would the right answer doom him or cut him free? She touched his human face, his beautiful long hair. She whispered the answer in his ear. This one is The Stone Bride. Once upon a time, there was a young wife whose husband never returned from sea. From a wind-swept precipice, she watched his sails dissolve into evening. As the red drained from the sunset, so too did it drain from her heart, leaving only salt-stained rock. Grief stiffened her joints, and mourning found her skin sheathed in a thin crust of chalcedony. There was still hope that he might come back, crack her open in a spill of quartz. But as night fell, the crystals inside her went dark. She remained on the cliff, mistaking each wink of whitecaps for his homecoming sails. She waited so long the barnacles grew around her feet like boots. She waited until she couldn't have looked away if she wanted to. She was worshipped as a monument to faithfulness. Young women crowned her with bleeding hearts, pledging fidelity, praying for patience. How could she tell them that she waited not out of love, but out of vengeance? That she waited only to see his face when he saw what he'd done? And then this last one in the series is The Adulterous Bride. Once upon a time, there was a wife who wouldn't die. Each time she was beheaded, she smiled as the guillotine smiled down at her. Then she'd appear somewhere in the crowd, her neck as seamless as a swan's. Gradually, the screams became applause, the killing machine a tourist attraction. Soon, they were charging admission. The wallpaper tax was stripped, the candle tax snuffed out. The window taxes were lifted, and the peasants unbricked their casements. But while the Commonwealth prospered, the king's heart grew thin as a blade. He himself had issued the death sentence, and he wouldn't tolerate such mockery. She died hundreds, thousands of times a day. Her neck became a starched ruff of scar tissue, and her blood ran clear as holy water. But she was not the one being punished. The king could not sleep or eat roast pheasant or remarry or even die for fear of what came after. With each thud of the blade, he felt his own head roll. And so I'm going to close out with some excerpts from my first collection, Life on Dodge. And for a little bit of context there, Life on Dodge is a sonnet collection. I call it Sci-Fi Meets Shakespeare. And it follows a loose narrative arc about a long-distance relationship where one person is in Virginia and one person is on an imaginary planet named Dodge. And Dodge is sort of the physical embodiment of chronic pain. And so that is a theme that I explore very deeply in that collection. And I think that contextualizes the pieces that follow. These are untitled, but I'm going to be reading 4 different sonnets. When you left, there was a sound like the scraping of a dagger being unsheathed from my heart. And in the left behind hollow, a red bat came to roost. Good, I thought, because bats go where moths go, and moths go where the light is, which means there's still something like a street lamp in me, however dusty and guttering. But where its corona bleeds to black, you can still hear it. the sleek shriek of steel against bone, the infinite echo of you pulling away. You have gone, and so can I. I can go to a red planet with no name, no coordinates. There is no wind here, no dust, nowhere to stake a flag. No rotation, no view, no ocean under the crust, and no ice at the poles. There is no gravity, no atmosphere, and no one to name its craters. There is not a robot to help repair the spaceship I don't have. There are no giant worms in the sand. There is no sand. There is nothing here, but not enough of it. Torch in hand, I confront the pain in its burrow. It blinks owlishly at me, talons scraping the iron from the soil. It looks almost surprised at the distress it's causing me, its pupils perfect apologies in its lamplit stare. We're equally helpless, the pain and I, for it must eat and I must run. And this burrow has been here since the day I was born, brooding over its chicks as they hatch, as they shake the pennies and blood from their feathers, as they step from the shards and learn to hunt. And then this final poem is from the end of the collection, so it ends on a little bit of a nicer note. Gradually, this new life closes over your absence like a scab. The wound was smaller than it felt, the world so much bigger. Right down the street, an abandoned gaslight plant overgrown with grass and children. A farmer's market selling strawberry muffins and goat's milk soap. You always thought leaving me would be pulling a pin from a grenade, thought I couldn't withstand such cataclysmic detonation. But this is me climbing from the crater, washing the red down the drain. On the far side of Dodge, glaciers roll back to reveal circles of standing stones, dolmens full of bones. To detonate is to excavate, to unlayer. Beneath the pungent smoke is a certain sweetness. Beneath the separation, a kind of marriage.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rita. You shared such great excerpts from these different poetry projects of your life. And I was really struck by how the first two poems you described as personal origin stories. So you have Sylvia Plath and the Unicorn in the Lake. And then later you describe Life on Dodge as sci-fi meets Shakespeare. So I'm just curious how poetry and different poets and writers have influenced your work from the beginning, and has that changed? And do you have different influences now?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I've always loved fantasy. That's always been the genre of my heart, and that hasn't changed. But I think my influences over the years have changed. So one reason why that first poem is part of my origin story is because little known fact about me, I was a diehard horse girl when I was little, and I was insufferable about it. And I would get in trouble at school, actually, because I would make all of my assignments about My Little Ponies. And my teacher would have to tell me, like, you can't do that. But I knew what I liked. But that book, The Unicorn in the Lake, was one of many unicorn books that I had and read obsessively. And unicorns do still feature prominently in my work. But these days, I actually pull a lot of inspiration from video games. That's been really fruitful for me as a source of inspiration. And I didn't bring in any of those into the packet that I read today, but I do have a series of poems inspired by The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and then like The Witcher, Wild Hunt. Like those are games that like have really like captivated me. And that I've found a lot to latch onto in the games that I can like resonate with in my personal life. So that's been an influence in sort of another medium. But yeah, I'm I'm very inspired by a lot of fantasy stories and fantasy novelists. And one poet, Janine Hall Gailey, who I discovered a few years ago, has been hugely influential for me because her work also like really embraces like pop culture, fantasy tropes, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like she has so much fun bringing in like all of these like contemporary but also like folkloric like fantasy pieces. So yeah, so she's been a big influence for me.
That's awesome. I just wrote her name down so I can check her out later. And I loved how you said a little known fact when there I count at least 2 horse memorabilia pieces behind you. I have like the little statue and the and the
yeah,
photo.
The unicorn painting.
Yeah.
No, I didn't even realize it. I'd positioned myself with all my horse stuff.
Yeah.
Not like all my stuff.
The big reveal.
Yes.
Behind you. I was also curious, you write a lot about mythology. Do you ever see poetry as a way to create your own self mythology or create your own sort of creation story too?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Short answer, yes. And I was talking about this recently with a friend who's also a poet. I feel like the self in poetry is so slippery. And like, even when I'm writing about myself, it's never quite exactly literally me. And the self is always like fictionalized or aestheticized in some way in my work. And so I think that I am, yeah, constantly creating like a self mythology. I wouldn't have put it that way, but I love that. And I think that's very accurate to like the way I think of self in my work.
Yeah. And I see that we have some questions from the audience, which is amazing. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll weave it into our conversation. So one question from the audience I'd like to pull is, do you have a daily writing routine or do you write when inspiration hits?
I try to make it a daily practice. That's not always possible, and I try to be generous with myself when it's not. But I really do believe in just grit as part of the writing process and like sitting down and doing the work even when it's not fun. So I try to do it daily or as often as I can. I don't necessarily have like a ritual or a routine, but I do have things that like help me lock in when I'm not feeling it. And you know, another shout out to video games. Video game soundtracks just do something to my brain. Just put on the Skyrim soundtrack and like suddenly I can focus.
That's so cool. I'm similar with like film and TV soundtracks. Like the Severance TV show soundtrack is very motivating. It makes me feel like I'm locked in a cubicle in a basement, but like in a very, very like cool way. Like, yeah, like I want to work. And I also listen to the Lady Bird soundtrack a lot. So yeah.
That's a good one.
Feels like I'm in a movie. I also am curious about, does tarot, you mentioned tarot as like a family ritual, but does tarot ever factor into like a writing routine or ritual? I'm just asking because I have this deck of tarot cards that's called like the Literary Witch Tarot, and it's like not traditional tarot, but it's just like cards that have photos of or like drawings of female authors, whether it's poets, playwrights, or novelists, and then like other like kind of witchy objects. So like you could like pull a frog or you could pull like a sword. But yeah, so tarot and writing routine.
Yeah. That's not a regular tool that I use, but I definitely have in the past. And I think the tarot is so rich for that just because it is such a symbolic language and so is poetry. So I think like pulling a card as inspiration is such a good jumping off point because everybody's going to see something different in the image. And I think that kind of like associative logic is where poems are born from. So yeah, I think that's a really good tool. I have a fairy deck that that I like using for that when I do turn to cards for inspiration.
Is there such a thing as like a horse deck or like a My Little Pony deck?
Probably. And if there is, I should get my hands on one.
Definitely. Speaking of grit, when you are trying to write a poem, how does it usually come about for you? How do you access a poem? Does it start with an image, a certain kind of line or phrasing? What does that process look like for you?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I had to think about that a little bit ahead of time, just because it feels like it comes from like another realm of existence. And so I'm trying to identify like where does it come from? I'm a very project-driven poet, so I find it easiest to write when I do have like a bigger project that I'm compiling. So like the Persephone collection, Everything is Real, Life on Dodge, those all have like characters and a narrative arc and like strong concepts that I was working with. So when I'm in project brain, I can be like, okay, like here's the pattern I've established. So let me think of another myth that I pull from today. Or like here's a plot beat that's missing in this narrative arc. So let me write something about that. But if I don't have that, inspiration can come from anywhere. One of the poems in Life on Dodge actually came from some bathroom graffiti that I misread. The horses are going to be the theme of today because the line of graffiti said something like, let the bones in your skeleton be all the structure you need. But I read bones as horses. And I just thought, let the horses in your skeleton be all the structure you need was the coolest thing. So that became the seed of one of those poems. I also like I don't keep a journal in the traditional sense because I just find it unbearable to write about myself in like a reportage kind of way. But I do jot down like thoughts, impressions, observations, and just sort of like a stream of consciousness way all the time. And that's where I get a lot of like poem beginnings from, just like a phrase that's interesting, and then I build upon that.
And when you are writing, do you have a certain place where you usually like to write, or does it happen anywhere?
I love coffee shops. I'm a coffee shop writer. Yeah, that's where I'm most productive. But yeah, I've also curated a little writing desk for myself at home. That's just a bunch of. So my favorite movie is Jim Henson's Labyrinth. And so my writing desk is a shrine to that movie. So it's just like a bunch of like posters and art and tchotchkes associated with that.
That's so cool. I also love writing in coffee shops. There's something about like everybody else is doing work that motivates me to also do work, especially like the anonymity aspect of it when nobody knows who you are and you don't know who anybody is, but you're all like kind of united in your own common cause of being productive or like pretending to be mysterious over an iced latte.
All of those things, all of the above. But yeah, no, the sort of shared accountability of like, okay, we're all working, so we have to keep working. And like you can play mind games with yourself. Like I'm not leaving until that person leaves.
Exactly. And speaking of project-based writing, we have a question from the audience that asks, what are you working on next and how does it build off of your previous works?
Ooh, okay. I don't want to go into too much detail because I'm superstitious.
The secret.
But I will say that it's something else video game inspired. That's all I'll say.
Ooh, you have to.
Or hopefully it will be.
Yeah. Keep your eye out for Rita's next project. It's very cool. Speaking of your projects too, you didn't have a chance, or you didn't read from Meet Me in the Fourth Dimension, your young adult novel in verse, but I was curious, since it is a novel in verse, how did it differ from your previous writing projects? And you have like a sustained narrative throughout like Life on Dodge and the Persephone project as well. But was this like a different type of challenge for you to have it be a longer book? And were there moments when lyric and story were in tension? How did you navigate that?
Yeah. I love those questions, and I'm happy to talk about my process for that book. Um, so I love novels in verse, and I've been really excited about that form for a very long time. And I knew I wanted to write my own, and I was sort of just waiting for the subject matter to come along. And at the same time, I'd had this idea of a character who experiences like a new age crisis of faith, and like somebody who has really relied on tarot and astrology and that kind of like metaphysical knowledge to guide them, and what happens when that knowledge no longer serves them, and the sort of like existential spiral that could come from that. So I was really interested in exploring that character. And I started that book as prose, and I wrote about 20,000 words, and it just felt like agony. And I finally stopped because I realized like something fundamental is not working about this. And so as a last ditch effort to save it, I was like, what if I try putting this one in verse and just see what happens? And that fully unlocked the entire project, because it was a book it's so angry and it's so sad and it's so emotionally charged, that writing it in poems like really allowed me to distill it all down to its emotional core. And once I started cutting out exposition and scene work and everything that defines prose, I was like, this is the voice and this is the book. So in a lot of ways, it flowed out of me in sort of like a magical way, because it was a topic that I just had like so much to say about. But the things that were hardest to do were like the plot poems that needed to move the story forward, or like because it is a novel, like there are other characters, they have dialogue with each other, and those things were really hard to do while still maintaining the poetic voice. So there was definitely some tension there. And I had to navigate between like the very narrative voice and then the places where I could get like more image and emotion driven.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a question from the audience about titles, like how do you come up with titles for your poems and books? But I think one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading Meet Me in the Fourth Dimension is the way that you used titles as like a drop-in for the story and like motivating the whole book too. Like the first line of each poem just like grounded and set the pace of and made sure that the reader was really taken care of the whole time. So I don't know if you have anything to say about coming up with titles for your poems or collections.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's definitely one way I cheat, is just like using the first line of the poem like as the title. Because sometimes it's like, oh, like, well, what if this first line worked as the title instead, just to like lead us in and contextualize things. I think that because poems are so brief and have such limited real estate, the title is so important. It does so much work. And I think a good title really contains a lot of information and shows a reader how to approach the poem. Especially if the poem itself really like exists a lot in metaphor or language, then like having a really concrete grounded title can be super helpful. I think a lot about titles. I love titles actually. And either I know immediately what a poem is called or I agonize over it for months, and there is no in between.
Yeah, I think that speaking of music, and we were talking about listening to video game soundtracks and stuff, there are sometimes songs that are just called like blank song. Like, you cheated. You can't do that. You can't just call a song about the moon song, or like glue song. Like, that would be if I called something just like love poem or sadness poem, which would be like super cool and it would stand out, but it's also like, I would side eye
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah, it has to work harder to justify that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right now,
And Yeah, tell me.
Oh, right now I have a draft of something, and the title is just a bat emoji. And I'm like, I know I can't keep this, but now I kind of want to.
It'd be really cool if you could figure out how to make a bat out of characters. That might be a crazy challenge.
Yeah.
I was just at an art museum, and one of the exhibits was called Typescripts, and
Mhm.
it was this Italian artist. Her last name is Del Ora, and she created all of this art, kind of like a fusion between poetry and visual media, created entirely out of characters on a typewriter that she like just like repeated over and over again to create art. So it's like kind of blurring the line between poetry and art. So
That's really
maybe
neat.
you could do that with your bat emoji.
We'll work on it.
Yeah. And with voice in Meet Me in the Fourth Dimension, I kind of wanted to draw that back to the voice you mentioned. I think it was in Ten of Swords, or no, it was in The God of Your Own Thinness.
Mhm.
I noticed that The God of Your Own Thinness, the title was a lot smaller, and in Ten of Swords, you mentioned how you used it all lowercase for the body of the poem. So
Mhm.
how do you develop voice in your poems, and does it kind of happen after the fact or while you're writing?
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I always want to be trying new things. I think like one of my fears as a writer is stagnating. And that's part of what motivated me to go back to grad school to get my master's degree in poetry, because I just felt like I was writing like the same thing over and over again. And I just needed like new inspiration, new influences, new voices to sort of shake me out of that. And that's what I got. It was a great experience. But I yeah, I try to explore different aspects of voice and step outside of my comfort zone in that way. Um, I have a couple different styles that I think my work can fall into. And like there is the more narrative and conversational and casual. And then there is the um, more language and image driven, more music driven. And it sort of tends to happen organically, like which one of those voices comes out, but definitely like in revision, I'll curate it to make sure like the voice is lining up with the subject matter.
And your story about having like 20K words in prose and like finding the freshness and the new voice by putting into poetry is really, really cool. I'm wondering, do you ever think that, like, given that experience of poetry kindling the spark of a fabulous story, would you ever consider going back into the fiction genre or other genres?
Yeah. So most of my published work is poetry, but I do write fiction too, and I always have. And that's actually most of what I'm working on these days. Um, and I love both for different reasons. I think you can do things in poetry that you can't in prose and vice versa, but they definitely inform each other for me. And I think one thing that I learned about poetry, like very early on in my practice, is that the more poetry I read and wrote, the more I felt like my fiction was improving. Because I think poetry teaches you to pay attention to language on the most fundamental level. And that's just going to be transferable to any kind of writing. So no matter what I'm working on, I always feel like I have like those poetic considerations of like the rhythm of the line, the significance of the image, brevity, like all of those things.
Poetry definitely is the building blocks for all writing, and I think that it teaches you um, diction, which is something that I'm really impressed by in your work. We have a question from the audience about words, which is like, what's one word you find yourself using a lot in your writing? But then I wanted to also point out the unusual words in your writing. I had to look up the definitions for like airy, keened, pommel, and it was really cool to to see you use them with such flair in your poems, and also now have those words in my vocabulary as well. So how do you approach language at the level of the word? And are you actively seeking out these kind of unfamiliar or archaic words and language, or do they naturally surface in your writing based off of your previous readings?
Yeah. For the most part, they surface naturally. And I think it's because I'm such a nerd and I just read like so much fantasy and play so many fantasy video games. So I just like absorb that kind of vocabulary, which is by nature going to involve a lot of like archaisms. Because it's really important to me that my work is accessible. That's definitely one of my values as a poet. And so I don't want to intentionally confound people or pick a word that's like, feels like an SAT word. But I do love the thesaurus, and I'm constantly reaching for that when I'm writing. And often for my poetry, in word choice matters. It comes down to like music and sound reasons. Like there's a word whose meaning I want, but I'm like, that doesn't totally musically fit what I'm doing here. So I'll look at the thesaurus and see if I can find a synonym that's a little bit more sonically pleasing. So that's sort of my process there.
Specifically with pommel, use that in Ten of Swords, where this feeling, you personify this feeling of sadness and depression, and I feel like it's very embodied. And then when you say you take the sadness by the pommel, and when I heard you read it out loud, I almost heard you say you take sadness by the palm, and then I had this image of like sadness as a person, like being led by the hand, and I thought that was also just such a cool coincidence that happened because you used a word that might not be used in everyday language. Mm-hmm. There's also, are you familiar with the video game Elder Scrolls? Because there's a question in the chat about that, if you've ever written poems inspired by any of the games.
Yeah. I not yet, but it's coming. I have an idea for a collection that will maybe take shape one day, which would involve poems inspired by like a bunch of different stuff that I play, and that would definitely be on the list. But that's a project that exists in just like 3 or 4 poems right now. So stay tuned for that one too. But yes, that one would make the cut.
Very cool. Yeah. I want to turn to another section of your reading, which were the recurring bride poems. We have the Fox Bride, Sphinx's Bride, Stone Bride, Adulterous Bride. To me, they felt like folklore or parables, but set almost like they had very ancient or like historical groundings, but they resonated with the modern times as well. So what drew you to the figure of the bride as a central motif, and how did the poems evolve across the collection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for a little bit more context about that collection, there's sort of a protagonist figure. The speaker is a young woman who has conjured this sort of like shapeshifter boyfriend for herself. And he is used to explore a bunch of different romance tropes throughout fantasy and folklore. And particularly sort of like the dark romantic figure, like the allure of someone who is like interesting, compelling, magnetic, but also like sort of dangerous, probably because he's like a vampire or a werewolf. And all of this is playing out entirely within the scope of her imagination. So she is someone who always has agency because like these are stories that she's telling herself. But at the same time, like there's a point where she gets like a little bit lost in these fantasies and the relationship starts feeling toxic. So that's the main narrative arc that's happening. And then the bride poems are interspersed as sort of like additional lore, exploring those ideas of how women can have power and agency within a relationship, even if it doesn't seem on the outside like they do. Because in so many of those old stories, women don't have a lot of power, or if they do have power, they're like an evil sorceress. But I was really interested in the way that like power can be psychological. And so in the Stone Bride, where she's waiting for her husband till the end of time and she turns to stone, like in her mind, that's a form of vengeance. Like you'll feel so bad, like when you see me and what I've become. So those poems are really exploring that like psychological and like mind game dimension to power in a relationship.
Yeah, and the Stone Bride becomes more venerated and worshipped than her disappearing husband ever would be. He kind of like vanishes from the collective memory, but she kind of achieves. She stays within the minds of everyone for millennia, since she becomes ingrained part of the landscape. Like turning to more specifically the adulterous bride, I see how gender becomes entangled with power, like you mentioned, ownership, and specifically in this one, like economic exchange. Like like she ushers in a new wave of economic prosperity for the people who are like displaying her as kind of like a circus trick, which I thought was like very darkly amusing. But how are you thinking of the ways that femininity is constructed or constrained within these systems of power, ownership, agency?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know if in my writing process, like those particular themes were consciously present. I think that what I was interested in was an idea that was inspired by one of the collections that we read in one of my grad school classes. And I think I'm getting the title right. Useful information for the soon to be beheaded. And the collection of realist poems. And the poet zoomed into our class and we were asking her about her process. And she mentioned this idea of following the absurd to its logical conclusion. And I really, really loved that. And I wanted to explore something similar and just think about, okay, if there was this woman who could get beheaded over and over again and not die, then what would happen next? And that turned into this whole infrastructure of like, oh, of course that would like attract an audience. And then they would start charging admission for that. And then that would create like an economic boom in this town. So like I wanted to just think about all of the implications of this one like absurd or magical thing and then follow that through to its conclusion.
That's super cool. A great piece of advice for writers. I think I'm going to use that in my practice too. I also write a lot of humor, not just in my poetry, though it comes through, but also with like playwriting and scripts. So I like that absurd to its logical conclusion. I want to pull out another question from the audience, which was, if you could give one simple piece of advice to new writers, what would it be?
Oh, just to keep going even when it's hard. Like one bad day doesn't mean that a project is bad or isn't worth pursuing. I think that often if I push through something, I'll fall in love with it again. And working with young writers, myself as a teacher, I see so much discouragement happening. And if someone is stuck or frustrated with something, they might feel the impulse to just abandon it entirely. And like, it's hard, but keep going, because like you never know what's on the other side of that hurdle. And like you might discover something again in that project that like you are excited about and does bring you joy. And just finishing something is so satisfying. So yeah, just like determination and sticking with it, and just remembering that like everyone has hard days and days when you forget how to string a sentence together. But yeah, just like keep going and you'll find your rhythm again.
You have such a great perspective as a creative writing teacher and instructor of what like hard days look like for young writers. But what does a hard day of writing look like for you, and what's the hardest part of being a writer?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I do think that, you know, being where I am in my writing career and having publications and working towards that, like it can be easy to lose sight of the parts of the process that bring me joy. And I can be very self-critical. And so I think it's important for myself too, definitely to just remind myself of the joyful parts of the process. And that's what's led me into a lot of the like goofier or weirder things I've written. Everything is Real came out of a big writing slump, actually, because I'd been writing more personal poetry and it felt really like depressing. And I was like, I just want to do something fun. I'm going to write a poem about pirates. And then like that became an entire book. So yeah, no, definitely like for me too, I can get in my head. So I empathize with writers who struggle with that.
Yeah. To bring it kind of all full circle, what feedback has been the most helpful to you as a writer? Like what kind of changed your perspective on writing?
Yeah. Oh man, I've gotten so much good advice over the years. Um, I think that one piece though that really like enabled me to finish writing Everything is Real, which was my grad school thesis, was I was getting too tangled in my own mind over the story and the narrative aspects, and the plot was getting really complicated. And my mentor just said, don't write towards plot. And like that hit me at the right time. And I just needed permission to not worry about that. And I think because I'm a poet and because like language and vibes are always going to be my first priority, like plot is really hard for me. And I get overwhelmed just thinking about plot possibilities. And even as someone who writes fiction, I think the idea of just let go and like follow what happens organically and everything will be fine. I think that's been really important for me because I'm not an organizer, I'm not an outliner. Like if I try to map something out, I just like freak out. So like just accepting that like I am an organic writer and like it'll all come together eventually. And having somebody like to validate that has been very important to me.
Yeah, and clearly your writing process has produced such stunning, evocative imagery and poems, and I'm very lucky that I have had you as a mentor, a teacher, and now a conversation partner throughout this series.
Full
I want
circle.
to, yeah, to close out the session, I just wanted to ask you if there's a place where you can direct people to follow along for more of your work, or are there any upcoming publications you'd like to share?
Yeah, folks can find me on my website, ritafeinstein.com. Yeah, everything is there. I have samples of published work and my social media links. So that's the best place to find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rita.
Yes, thank you, Sophia.